Hello, Tansei Anin. Good afternoon. Welcome to APTN InFocus. I'm Daryl Stranger. Today we're putting corrections in focus. Our APTN Investigates team is rolling out a 4-part series on incarceration rates across Canada and zeroing in on issues that face Indigenous offenders in this country. We will speak to the reporters on the stories and find out what this series uncovered. Now, as always, we want you to join in on our conversation. You can tweet us at APTN InFocus on Twitter, or you can send us an email at infocus@aptn.ca. Now, before I introduce you to our first guest joining us here in studio, here's a preview of Brittany Guillot's 2,180 Days, the story of Joey Tootsaint, who spent almost 6 years in solitary confinement. And a warning, this story does contain footage and discussion of violence and self-harm.
We found terrible outcomes with respect to Indigenous people in federal corrections.
Just locked up all day. Go through a lot of mental breakdowns. Suicidal thoughts, self-harming.
Overrepresented in maximum security institution, overrepresented in structured intervention units.
All right, Tootsaint, stay on the ground. Stay on the ground.
He was in segregation for 2,180 days.
They're also overrepresented in terms of suicide.
In fewer than 5% of all of the placements in the structured intervention units was the law followed consistently.
Yeah, I'm really struggling. It's just, you just don't know what to do sometimes. There's no helping there, none at all.
Well, joining us now, like I said, in studio is APTN Investigates reporter Brittany Guillot. Brittany, it's great to have you in and chat with you.
Thanks for having me on.
So first off, why don't we start with you telling us about Joey Tootsaint?
Yeah, so Joey Tootsaint, he is a Dene man. He's from Black Lake First Nation, which is a fairly isolated community in northern Saskatchewan. And so he grew up with all the traditional ways and beliefs of the Dene people. Mm-hmm. He was raised by his mother and his grandfather, and sadly, when he was about 16 years old, his mom was hit and killed by a drunk driver. And then about a month and a half later, his grandfather passed away. Mm-hmm. And so there was one point in the interview with him where he said to me that if that hadn't have happened, if his mom and his grandfather were still around, he likely wouldn't be in prison. And so that just really stayed with me. Mm-hmm. And, you know, like going into it, I will admit that I had some preconceived notions about who Joey Tootsaint would be, you know, what his demeanor would be like, given that he is a dangerous offender and he's been given an indeterminate sentence. Which means that there's no telling when or if he's ever going to get out of prison. Mm-hmm. But when I got there, he was so far from any of the preconceived notions that I had. He was incredibly kind. He was very calm, and his knowledge of the criminal justice system and how Indigenous people are overrepresented at every level of the federal system really just blew me away.
So going, I guess, to the point of him being in prison, I mean, what did he initially get arrested for?
Yeah, so one of his initial charges was for stealing. So it was a pretty minor charge, and then it just sort of spiraled from there. It was a lot of institutional charges. He was in and out of prison for a while he was a youth. And he's just been through that revolving door of imprisonment since then.
So then, how did he end up in solitary confinement for the first time?
So for the first time, I mean, going into solitary confinement, It can be for a number of reasons. It could be for the safety of himself. It could have been for the safety of the other prisoners in the institution that he was housed in. But as I've come to find, the Correctional Service of Canada's response to suicidal thoughts and self-harming behavior is to place the offender in solitary confinement so they are safe.
Okay. So he's been in solitary confinement for almost 6 years now, right? Like, what's that been like for him when you interviewed him?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so as you can imagine, it's nothing short of incredibly traumatic for him. He's spent 2,180 days in solitary confinement, and that's only at the federal level. That's not including any of the time he spent in solitary in youth custody, as well as at the provincial level.
Okay.
And so when he is having, a bad day, and he's having suicidal thoughts and he's exhibiting self-harming behavior, the CSC, the Correctional Service of Canada, will send in what's called the Emergency Response Team, which is essentially a SWAT team.
Wow.
And that's the response to a mental health crisis. So there's people coming into his cell and screaming and swearing and throwing him to the ground. And so as you can imagine, you're having a bad day. That's incredibly traumatic.
Yeah, I can't even begin to think of what something like that would be like. Now, as we mentioned, so you did go behind bars to interview Joey. What was that experience like for you? You had touched on it a little bit, but what was that like? Mm-hmm.
So I had put in the request to the Correctional Service of Canada probably a month or 2 months before I actually wanted to interview Joey. And it would have been about 2 or 3 days before the interview date that we got the okay to go ahead. And so we just kind of quickly got everything together. I got on a plane, drove out to the institution from Toronto. It's about a 2-hour to 3-hour drive, and it's beautiful. It's a beautiful drive out there. It's right in the heart of the Great Lakes, and then you take a turn to go to the Millhaven Institution, and it's this stark contrast of beauty and the correctional facility, which is, there's guards everywhere. It's completely fenced in. There's barbed wire fences, and actually, as we were driving on the property, a guard pulled us over. So as I rolled my window down to speak with him, I look over and I see that he actually has a rifle in his passenger side. So it's exactly how you would expect it to be. It's a maximum security facility, so it's scary going in there.
And was this the first time you had visited a prison yourself?
It is, yeah. It's the first time, and I hope it's the only time I ever go.
Right.
Yeah.
So then, after all of this and you started learning more about solitary confinement and everything, what else did you sort of learn or find out about solitary within Canada?
Mm-hmm. So there was a number of things that stood out to me, and one of the things that really stayed with me was the symptoms of solitary confinement, and that is social withdrawal. So the Correctional Service of Canada is supposed to allow a prisoner to leave their cell for an X amount of hours a day. Mm-hmm. And what we see is that prisoners don't want to leave their cells. They want to stay there. Okay. And that's because there is no meaningful human contact outside of their cells when they're imprisoned.
So then just 2,180, that's such a long time. So was it just because you had mentioned the expressive self-harm? Is that why it was sort of a continuous time? Is that basically why he spent all of that time in solitary?
Yeah, my understanding is that he has a number of mental health challenges, and it angers him to be imprisoned. And so when he is in solitary and he's exhibiting self-harming behavior, the emergency response team often is called in to assist, and it angers him. And so it's just this endless cycle of him going into solitary, getting out, and then going right back in.
And you had mentioned a bit of, excuse me, about, you know, he was completely not what you had thought he was, right? So when you were interviewing him, I imagine you felt safe and you felt secure during that whole interview. But like, could you just sort of explain for our audience maybe a bit more about what that process was like for you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Joey, he was just a regular person. He wasn't as you would expect a dangerous offender to be. I felt completely safe. And he was just really upset at his treatment in prison. Right. And that was something that he tried to get across to me numerous times, is that the treatment that he's experiencing is something that nobody should ever have to go through.
Mm-hmm. Well, Brittany, we'll have to leave it there, but we certainly appreciate you coming in and updating us a little on the experience and who Joey is and his story and your story as well. So your episode airs, I believe, this Friday on APTN Investigates, so our audience can certainly catch that. But Brittany, thank you so much for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
All right, let's go over to social media now with our social media editor, Jesse Andrushko, to hear what some of you are saying about today's topic.
Thanks, Daryl. Online, we asked, what steps do you think should be taken to address the over-incarceration of Indigenous peoples in Canada? We received some good responses. Let's take a look. First, from Charles on Facebook. Canada needs a separate justice system from the political influence it has now. First Nations will not have justice until Canada has a separate court and policing system from the politicians. Hannah says, how about First Nations have their own police, courts, jails, treatment centers, etc.? From Dean, at this point in the justice system, all we do is talk about how unfairly we are treated. It's just too biased for us First Nations people. Nothing will ever happen. Zachary said, start off by educating more Indigenous lawyers, judges, etc., and establish courts and our own police. Miss Mayer said, land-based restorative justice programs. Lastly, from Jennifer on Twitter, use humanitarian thinking and let the Indigenous people be seen as the proper humans they are. Thank you to everyone for commenting. If you want to share your thoughts, here's how. Send an email to infocus@aptn.ca, like us on Facebook on our APTN News page, or follow and tweet us at APTN InFocus.
All right, we have to take a short pause here on the program. We will have plenty more on this topic when we come back. Welcome back to APTN in Focus. Rob Smith has been a journalist for decades and with APTN Investigates for the last 10 years. He's a video journalist in Vancouver, British Columbia. His segment for the Correction series is called Hard Time and focuses on John Derek Mills, a 60-scoop survivor from the Waterhen Lake First Nation in Saskatchewan. His lifetime of crime ended up in a botched armed robbery attempt. Here's a quick preview of Hard Time.
And these are things I don't talk about. I've never acknowledged the 60-scooper residential school.
John Derek Mills is Cree from Waterhen Lake First Nation.
If I used to just push it down, I would usually explode every 6 months in a violent, fit.
Found on Osler, one had a gun, one had a knife. Units copy, gun and knife produced. Short fired,
And whoever was unlucky enough to be around me at that time, they would get the brunt of that. And for that, I'm sorry.
He's been in prison 28 years for a botched armed robbery and kidnapping.
10-4, car 10 copy. 10 copy.
He admits to the robbery, but not the kidnapping.
We found, again, terrible outcomes.
Our crew at Investigates committed to this correction series because, well, the stats are simply outrageous.
It is shocking, and it's a human rights violation.
Even criminal justice members are shocked, and in so many ways they're beside themselves and they don't even know what to do anymore.
critics are not shy to call the CSC broken, the terminus of a broken society, a broken country. Indigenous people are 25% of all accused, 33% less likely to be acquitted, 32% of prison population.
We just kind of repeat and recycle a lot of the same practices that we've been doing over and over again.
We now have more young people in the child welfare system than were in the residential school. That is a pipeline directly into our prisons.
The height of Canadian racism is achieved in Canadian prisons. First Nation leader George Manuel wrote those words way back in 1974.
So when you start to say that the prison system is the height of racism, I would have to agree.
John Derek Mills' story is both compelling and unbelievable. He's now doing his time in Archambault Prison, located a few hours outside Montreal. But he's been incarcerated in prisons all over the country.
Across from you. Your initial sentence was life 7. Yeah. Life 7. Why are you still in jail?
I do want to get out of jail, but I'm not going to admit to something that didn't happen or I didn't do in order to get out of jail. And that sucks because I'm going to be in jail for a long time.
And Rob Smith joins us now from Vancouver. Rob, it's great to chat with you and hear a bit of this story.
Hi, how's it going?
So we'll start simple and just, who is John Derek Mills?
John Derek Mills is a Cree man from Saskatchewan. He's been in jail most of his life since he was 16 years old. I think the most he's ever been out of jail is for a 6-month time period. Other than that, in and out of jail, in and out of jail. And he's been in jail now for about 28 years on a botched armed robbery and kidnapping. He's somebody we've been at Investigates talking to for about 7 years now. This has been percolating for a long time. He feels his case was a miscarriage. He feels that his story says that there was no kidnapping involved. That's something we get into in the story. But that's the reason why John was a inmate we wanted to focus on during this series.
So you kind of answered my next question here for you, Rob, was how does he feel about the situation he's in? It sounds like he's kind of frustrated a little bit maybe with what's going on.
Yeah, he's very frustrated, and part of his sentence was life 7, which means he could have got out on parole. Excuse me, could have got out on parole after 7 years. However, because he's not taking responsibility, as corrections would say, for the kidnapping part of his crime, he would never get parole. So he could be in jail, as he says, still for a very long time. And it is frustrating for him. He believes that they over-exaggerated what he was doing, because of the police overreaction on that night. And again, we go into that in depth in the story.
So can you tell us a little bit about how his background led him to where he is today?
Well, that's an important question. Part of the series and part of this particular story, we're taking a 30,000 view look at corrections itself, and we're going to bring forward the history of prisons, the relationship with First Nations and the correction system has been built on dysfunction, systemic racism. And that's something that is, what we're finding, what the critics are saying is not something from the past. These systemic racist attitudes govern things as we go today. So we wanted to take John's story and use it as an example, have him tell his story throughout this piece, but the broader issue is looking at a very extremely broken system that people for decades now have been saying reform, reform, and just a glacial pace of change is taking place, and there are people in jail right now who are just watching as this glacial pace takes place.
So, Rob, when you made a lot of really good points there. So, when you had first heard of this, and the Investigates team first heard of this case, ultimately, why did you guys decide to investigate his case?
Well, part of it is the question. Excuse me. Is he in jail on something he didn't do? I mean, that piqued our interest right away. So that's one of the reasons we thought we'd tell his side of the story. Now it's a 30-year-old story, and it's, you know, there's a lot of he said, she said, back and forth. You know, he does admit that he needs something new, some new evidence to come forward for it to become a case in which can be then retried, because that's what he wants. He wants a new trial. He doesn't want parole. He doesn't want, like, he wants that designation that he kidnapped and threatened the young girl stricken. That's, as I say in the piece, the hill he's going to die on, and so that's where he's at. That's why we wanted to feature him in this story.
And Rob, you had touched a little bit on my next question here, and that's what issues does his case bring forward specifically when it comes to cases like his and just as a broader whole?
Yeah, well, I think almost every issue, he seems to have fallen through, you know, every hole in a social safety net that you could possibly have to end up where he is. I mean, he admits to the things he's done, and he made his own choices, and, you know, he says he was a very violent man. But on the same hand, taken away from his family you know, at 3, living on the streets, bad influences who got him into crime, not knowing and fully being aware of some of the things that he did that led him to being in a penitentiary at 16 years of age. So just some naivety that as a child, if somebody was around to guide him, you know, where would he be now? If he was with his family, where would he be now? He laments the fact that all his family are normies. They're just citizens, as he calls them. And he just looks at a life, if he could have been caught and didn't fall through one of those holes, maybe something could have been different in his life.
Mm-hmm. And Rob, you've covered a number of issues with justice and Indigenous peoples, including wrongful conviction. And just with that, what are maybe some of the more pressing issues that continue to plague Indigenous offenders specifically?
Well, again, I think that's something we get into in the story. I think overrepresentation and why First Nations spend longer in jail, why more of them are sent to jail in the first place. There's an interesting unintended consequence of bringing in culture into the prisons, bringing in sweats into the prisons. There's suggestion that judges now think, well, maybe that's the best place for people because they have access to these activities and culture, which is very bizarre. You know, people, you know, shouldn't be going to prison to get their culture. You know, but that is one of the unintended consequences of, you know, certain reforms that have taken place over the past 30 years. So those are just some of the issues, overrepresentation, and why our people are staying much longer in prison than other people.
And last one here for you, Rob. What are some of the experts and advocates saying about this?
Well, they're getting to a point where of complete frustration that. Ivan Zinger, who just brought out one of his annual reports, he's the watchdog of the system, tells us that, you know, for 30 years they've been giving recommendations, and he can't see one. He says it would be hard pressed to find one of the recommendations that the CSC had followed. It's broken. Systemic racism is still an issue. It's a modern issue. It's not something left over from the old days. The attitudes are there, entrenched, and our people, the inmates, are dealing with that on a daily basis.
Well, Rob, thanks so much for coming on here, and we certainly look forward to Hard Time, which airs, I believe, on March 17th. So we certainly appreciate you coming on and giving us a quick preview and then a little insight into what Hard Time is. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
The Cuzant sisters case has captured headlines across the country as we move on to our next story here. Priscilla Wolfe is updating their case for the Corrections series. The two sisters say they were wrongfully convicted for a 1994 murder. APTN National News has followed the story since a 2020 episode of APTN Investigates. That one was called A Life Sentence. Now, here are some of the news stories we've produced on the sisters. In Yorkton, the bail hearing for the Cuzant sisters, is wrapping up. The sisters say they were wrongfully convicted of the murder of a Saskatchewan farmer. After spending nearly 30 years in prison, support from advocates across the country is pouring in. Tamara Pimentel has that story.
On day 2 of a bail hearing and on her 51st birthday, Adelia Cuezant looks back at a lifetime institutionalized.
I was talking to my oldest daughter, Haley, and she was mentioning, she was like, wow, Mom, you're 51 today, and you were in prison 30 years and 4 or 5 years in a boarding school, so I've been confined most of my life.
She and her sister, Narissa, arrived at the Yorkton courthouse Wednesday with support from family and advocates, pushing for the two to be released after spending 30 years in prison for a murder their cousin confessed to. Advocates Nicole Porter and Dan Godberzen partnered with Change.org to create a petition to free the Cuezant sisters. They've so far received over 60,000 signatures.
We wanted the country as a whole to know how many concerned citizens there are, and we would like to see ultimately the Justice Minister in Saskatchewan make attempts at reconciliation here. So our big goal was to deliver these signatures to her.
Godberzen wasn't successful in submitting the petition while spending Tuesday outside the Saskatchewan legislature. But signatures are still rolling in from across the country and some from the States.
I'm here for the sisters, the miscarriage of justice. This is 30 years and it's just deplorable.
Senator Kim Pate used to be the executive director of the Elizabeth Fry Society, supporting women in jail. She said she met the sisters when they were first incarcerated.
So what's really important for people to know is all of those breaches, in almost every case, they were continuing to live their lives. They were contributing to the community. I mean, when Narissa was unlawfully at large for over 2 years, she was actually working with people in the downtown east side. She was sheltering animals and fostering them. She was working. She was not posing a risk to public safety. And that what the judge has to look at is, will releasing these two women on bail pending the review of their wrongful convictions result in a risk to public safety? And I think the very clear answer is no.
The judge won't be making a decision for at least another month, but Adelia says she refuses to give up hope for a positive outcome.
This should be reconciliation today, and I honestly still believe in my heart that everything's gonna work out today, and I just keep praying every day. My team wouldn't be here if they didn't believe we were innocent, so I'm praying.
Well, Priscilla joins me now from Saskatoon to update the story. Priscilla, it's great to see you and talk to you. I understand you've been working on an update to this case. So what is the latest here?
Hi, Daryl. Yes, thanks for letting me discuss this story today. And since Tamara did the story last month in January, 2 months ago, I had met up with Adelia, and because the justice said that he didn't want to make a decision until he returned from vacation. He had set a date for February 23rd. APTN did go to the court hearing. And again, at the court hearing, Justice Lay said that he still needed more time to review. And the good thing about it is one of Odelia and Narissa's lawyers, Deanna Harris, said that, at least he's taking his time. And what he did was he set a court date for March 27th. He may make a decision before then. And if he does, he'll let people know. And for now, we're waiting till March 27th, and hopefully both of the sisters can attend.
Well, you've spent a number of days working with the sisters and Odelia specifically last month. So how is she doing and how are they doing?
Well, I didn't get to meet Narissa in person, and I did meet Odelia, and, she's hopeful. She's very hopeful, and the thing about her is, she's patient, and she's very supportive of her sister, helping her sister stay positive because, she's the older sister. And David Milgaard, who's passed away, he was a very strong advocate for the sisters. And Odelia mentioned, she feels his spirit there. And even when she was at court in February on the 23rd, she said she felt his spirit there, and it really helped her stay hopeful.
Well, you mentioned a little bit about this earlier, Priscilla, but the sisters they're awaiting bail now, right? So when will they know what's going to happen? Is it that date on March 27th, or you mentioned it could be before, right?
Right. It could be before. It probably will be March 27th. Let's hope that they do get a decision on that date, because they've already waited, a couple months now. And, I guess it's really hard for them, as well as all the people that, are advocating for them and their family and friends. So hopefully March 27th is the date. Maybe it'll happen sooner, though.
Mm-hmm. Well, I had mentioned in the intro about the previous APTN Investigates episode that aired in 2020. How much influence did that episode have in publicizing the case and making people aware of what's going on in this case?
Well, that was a very intense episode, or 2 episodes actually, and I think it got a lot of attention. Up until then, Odelia had told me when I met up with her in person that she spent a lot of time trying to write to people, trying to write to FSIN, trying to write to lawyers, asking for help, asking them to just look at her case, to consider her case. And when the episodes aired on APTN Investigates, people took notice. Advocates across the country, Innocence Canada, David Bellegarde, and the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, Change.org, and even some retired past judges. So they've gotten a lot of attention because of that, because of the Investigates 2-piece story that aired.
And Priscilla, a lot has happened obviously since that episode aired, and a lot's been going on recently as well. Are you able to sort of walk us through what's happened since then, and then maybe not every detail, but sort of a general overall what's gone on?
Well, that aired in 2020, and since then, Narissa, I guess she's in BC. She's in jail in BC. But Odelia has been out on day parole for about a year now, and she's been doing very well. She was in Winnipeg and is now in Saskatchewan to be closer to her family, and she's on day parole. And in, last year, 2022, she was able to go to Ottawa to plead for her freedom to the Minister of Justice. And the good news is that she did get a response, and her lawyer, or their lawyer, was able to apply for a ministerial review. And that's what they're waiting for. And that was done in late December of 2022. And that's why they had the bail hearing in January, because ministerial reviews can take years. So while they're waiting, their lawyers, their defense lawyers, want them to be out on bail. And that's kind of that's where we are right now. And we're just waiting to find out what's going to happen and if they're going to get out on bail. And then after that, it's still waiting for the review to happen.
Okay, so still lots to be waiting on, it sounds like. Priscilla, wrongful convictions are really hard and tough to prove. So who's in their corner fighting for them?
Well, we know that Innocence Canada, the Congress of Aboriginal People, specifically National Vice Chief Kim Bowden, Change.org, Nicole Porter, she has a petition with over 60,000 signatures. And there's a lot of people, I think, that are aware of what's going on. And a lot of it is because of the APTN coverage, but other media have been covering it. So it seems like they do have a lot of advocates and people waiting to find out what will happen and hoping that they'll be free, including their family and friends, of course.
And given everything that's been going on, how has Saskatchewan responded to all of this?
Well, unfortunately, you know, they didn't get the answers that they wanted from Saskatchewan. You know, their lawyers. What they did get was Saskatchewan Justice wrote to the defense lawyer saying that the Crown does not see a reason to reconsider the verdicts of the sisters, but they are cooperating with the review.
Okay, we'll keep that in mind. Priscilla, we'll have to leave it there, but we certainly appreciate you coming on APTN InFocus here today and sharing a bit of what your episode is and again, more of the Q-Zen sisters stories. So thank you so much for coming on. Your episode airs, I believe, on March 24th, and it's titled The Long Road Home, right? So we can look forward to that. So thanks so much, Priscilla. All right, we have to step aside one more time here on APTN InFocus. We're not quite done, though. We still have another interview to come.
Join our conversation now. Like us on Facebook on our APTN News page. Follow or tweet us at APTN InFocus. And send your thoughts to infocus@aptn.ca.
Welcome back to APTN in Focus. Tom Fenario is the newest member of the APTN Investigates team. He was the longtime producer of APTN's French newscast Nouvelle Nationale. Tom's episode, The Prison Within, is still currently in production, and it looks at the Special Handling Unit, Canada's only supermax prison for inmates too dangerous even for maximum security. And Tom joins us now to talk about this. Tom, hi, how are you?
Hi, Daryl. Thanks for having me.
So I want to start off just with the distinction of what is supermax versus max.
Right. So as you mentioned, there's only one in Canada. It's about 50 kilometers north of Montreal. And as you also mentioned, it's called the Special Handling Unit, or also known by its acronym SHU, S-H-U. But despite its very innocent-sounding name, SHU, it's actually pretty harsh, the conditions there. Inmates spend upwards of 22 hours a day in a cell, sometimes more if there's a lockdown. And when they do leave their cell, they are frequently in difficult conditions with other dangerous offenders. Let's not mince words. If you're in the SHU, you're there for a reason. You might have hurt a guard, you might have hurt another inmate, but often people who are there are troubled. And one of the things about the Special Handling Unit is you get less services, less mental health support, and so it's a difficult place for difficult people, and many of the people in there are Indigenous, and they're not getting services that are offered to them, which is kind of a big part of my story.
Well, Tom, I understand you've spoken to former inmates of the SHU. So what did they have to say about their experience?
Definitely not a 4-star Google review, let me tell you that. Some of them wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy, is a direct quote. Horrible. One inmate described to me in detail being stabbed there, despite the increased security measures. But sometimes it's a little bit more, not as violent as that. Sometimes it's just the idea of spending so much time by oneself is incredibly difficult for mental health. As I mentioned, a lot of people are there because of mental health issues, and there's very much a lack of services for people there who perhaps are the ones who need it most. It's not just inmates or former inmates who are telling me this as well. Senator Kim Pate has been on the record as saying that the SHU violates the Mandela Rules, which is the UN Convention for the Humane Treatment of Prisoners. Yeah.
And Tom, can you, just going back to the distinction a little bit here, can you explain a little bit more about how the security classification works?
Right. Okay. So Indigenous and Black men are placed at maximum security institutions at twice the rate of other offenders. And this is important to know because when you are moved up from, say, medium to maximum or maximum to the SHU, you get less services. And we know that services, especially services for Indigenous offenders, is an important part of the rehabilitation. And one of the things that I hear a lot is that everybody in Canada, almost everybody in Canada who is incarcerated gets out eventually. The numbers are somewhere between 80 and 90%. And who are we sending back out into the world and who are we sending back out into Indigenous communities is a very important question that my story aims to answer. And when you have things like people spending up to 22 hours a day in jail, not getting services, violence, constantly not getting training for work outside of prison, it adds a lot, right? And when you get sentenced to prison, there's an algorithm that decides where you are placed in security. It's called the custody rating scale. And so you have an algorithm that decides where you go, and several reports have shown that this algorithm can be biased towards Black and Indigenous prisoners. And on top of that custody rating scale, corrections authorities are allowed to override it. So they are, if a custody rating scale says you can go into minimum security, correction staff can actually say, you know what, I think you deserve to be in a higher rating scale. And the Auditor General of Canada did a study that shows that correction staff overrode up to 46% of minimum security placements for Indigenous offenders, the higher levels, compared with like 33% for non-Indigenous offenders. So there needs to be a lot more oversight in terms of just like who goes where, because as we've discussed a bit, like where you end up depends on what kind of services you get, and what kind of services you get depends on what kind of person you are when you are released back into society.
That's a really good point. I'm really glad that you were able to clear that up, and I'm sure a lot of other people weren't actually aware that something like that happens. So as part of your story too, Tom, you visited an Indigenous healing lodge as well. So what is that used for here?
Yeah, so there are actually two kinds of Indigenous healing lodges in Canada. There are those that are run by Corrections Canada, and there are those that are actually independent but contracted by Corrections Canada. And they're called healing lodges, and what they are actually is minimum security prisons. So it's often a place where people go to finish off their sentence, Indigenous folks, obviously. And reports have shown that they are very efficient. They work really well. It's a great way to help ease people back into society. The one I went to go visit is called Wessiskun. It's about 2 hours north of Montreal. And what is important about what Wessiskun and other healing lodges do is that they provide elders, sweat lodges, medicine rooms. Like you just basically like I hope if you work there, you can't be allergic to sage because sage is just burning constantly. And what's important is that folks don't get this regularly in even medium, forget maximum or the SHU. And so I spoke to folks who worked there. I spoke to a man who was finishing off his sentence there, and they both talked about the benefits of this. But I didn't even have to take their words for it because lots of reports have shown that healing lodges are a great way to reintegrate Indigenous folks back into society and back into their communities. And some of the questions that my story will look into getting into is like, can we maybe have healing lodges that are medium security so we can get people into them sooner? And one thing that's incredibly difficult that was shown in the last correctional ombudsman report is that the beds there in healing lodges across Canada are only 50% full. And the one that I went to go visit is in fact only 50% full. So you have these beds sitting empty, and the place I went to go see, Wessiskun, like their roof needs to be repaired, but they get paid per offender, and they have people on a waiting list, and they have beds sitting empty, and meanwhile they need to fix things, they need money, they need a budget, and there's no lack of people who need these services. So how do we get these beds that have been proven to work more full and more frequently is an important question that my story wants to get into. So yes, we start off with like the supermax and these incredibly harsh conditions that folks are in, but it also aims to look into like the solutions and frankly why the solutions seem to be not used as much as they could be.
Mm-hmm. And Tom, who else have you spoken to for this story and for some information?
Well, I probably should mention that the Special Handling Unit, the SHU, is a part of a class action lawsuit. So I've spoken to folks who are former and even current inmates of the SHU, but I have to hide their identities because of the class action lawsuit of which they're part of. I've spoken to their lawyer. I've spoken to a criminologist. I've spoken to a former inmate who has been released into society, and he is a year in. And I think what's interesting about his story is that he serves maybe perhaps as a cautionary tale, as someone who perhaps could have been rehabilitated quicker if we'd done things a bit differently. But at the same time, he's kind of a success story too, in the sense that he's been out for a year, he's working, he's acquired skills, and he hopes to be able to go back and visit his home community for the first time in decades, eventually. So, and I even have an interview, to be honest. I'm still shooting my story, so it's almost a little unfair that you guys are making me come on and talk about it, but I'm doing my best here. I have an interview on Friday with Corrections Canada to ask them some of the questions that I'm raising here right now and be like, for lack of a better word, what's up, guys?
Mm-hmm. Well, we certainly appreciate you coming on, even though it isn't still in production. Just one more for you, Tom, before I let you go and get back to getting this thing ready to go. Just sure. Out of curiosity aspect here, what was getting access to the SHU like? Was it difficult? Was it like, how was the access portion of that?
Unfortunately, I have not gotten access to the SHU. I am waiting on an official response, but to be honest, I don't have my hopes up. I don't think they're going to let me in. Basically, a lot of my interviews with folks have been done via video chat through lawyers. It is a supermax, so I understand that there may be, security issues. Mm-hmm. But Corrections Canada, like many public agencies, are not the most transparent places in the world, and so I guess one thing I ask myself a lot is, like, we have this question of, like, yes, people need help and they need services for their rehabilitation, but also, guards and staff deserve to be in secure places too, right? They shouldn't have to worry about being injured mm-hmm. or hurt at work too. And I guess one thing a question I hope to pose to folks is, like, is there not, like, can we not have a balance or an in-between here? Can we not get a little bit more services for folks who perhaps need them the most without compromising the security of others? I think right. Is a worthy question.
Yeah, that's a great point, Tom. And with that, I'll let you go and get back to producing this. Your episode airs on March 31st, I believe, right? So The Prison Within is the title of it. So, Tom, we really appreciate you coming on, and we look forward to your episode and all the episodes.
Always a pleasure, Daryl. Thanks.
Now, the 4-part series starts this Friday, March 10th at 6:30 Eastern, and that's right after APTN National News, so you can be sure to stick around and check that out. And with that, that is all we have for you this week on APTN in Focus. Now, today's episode will be available as a podcast. You can listen and subscribe on aptnnews.ca/podcast or find us on your favorite player. And if you missed any of our past episodes and you want to catch up, you can find them and more on aptnnews.ca/infocus. A big thank you to the amazing journalists from APTN Investigates for joining us this week, and to you as well for tuning in, and we certainly look forward to those stories. I'm Daryl Stranger. Have a great afternoon.
As part of our look inside corrections, APTN Investigates has been given special access to the Millhaven institution. Their maximum security unit is considered one of the most dangerous places in Canada's prison system. Approximately 500 inmates are incarcerated at Millhaven, and we're here to speak with one of them.
Hey Joey, how's it going?
I'm good.
Nice to meet you. I'm Brittany.
Joey Tootsaint has spent his entire adult life incarcerated. He first entered the legal system at the age of 15 on minor charges. He's now 36 years old.
Just locked up all day. Go through a lot of mental breakdowns, suicidal thoughts, self-harming. And I try to reach out to mental health, but mental health don't work, don't help at all. And I've been slashing up a lot.
Isolation, self-harm, suicide, all are more likely to occur with Indigenous inmates.
And I've been slashing up, and then just after that, the guard called, told me to kill myself one night, and I cut my neck open.
Indigenous inmates continue to be overrepresented at all levels of Canada's criminal legal system. Labeled a dangerous offender after a robbery conviction in 2009, Joey now has an indeterminate sentence, meaning only the courts can decide when or if he will